Hi.
Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I am thrilled to be chatting with graphic designer and art director Michael Harring. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Ali. It's great to be here.
And so I want to start by asking you about the movie you directed called The Mountain, the River, and the Road. I'd love to hear about that project.
Wow. Yeah. I'm definitely rusty at talking about it, but so yeah. So where was that? I've been a lifelong lover of movies, and of course, like anyone who like loves something always kind of like decides they want to try it for themselves, or maybe not always, but that's always like how I get into to new things. Yeah, and I ironically like before I got into film, I was into like comics, video games, and for whatever re oh and special makeup effects. I think that was one of the things that like really got me into to film was like the monsters at first. And so I remember like trying to kind of create my own monsters at some point. And I don't know why, but at some point I thought, you know what? Like making monsters are really difficult. Like there's a lot of technical things. Like I'd done a sculpture. I had what was it? Gotten like a cold foam latex kit, which is basically about pouring how and it's supposed to be an easier way to do the like appliance foam. And it totally was awful. It didn't work out, and I just became really depressed. And I was just like, well, clearly I can't make monsters. Maybe I should do something easier, like making movies. And so that
Right.
kind of like started me off on film. I took film classes at University of Washington. At the time, actually, when I started, they didn't even have a film program. I went in with the idea of being a business major, but they did have film classes. And so I basically, was a comparative literature major with an emphasis on cinema studies. And so my idea, learning about film, I was like, well, I'm going to be like it's going to be like the French New Wave, you know. It was all very like theory based, very like about the text, film as text. And so basically, like I'm going to be like Francois Truffaut or Jean-Luc Godard, and come from like the academic side and make movies and change everything. And of course, and then at night I would take production classes at oh shoot, I think it was called Seattle Film School is what it became. But I think when I started, it was called the Media School. Basically, like from then on, I just started making short films. What was it? I had a different script that I had hoped to make. Like I found some friends in Seattle. I worked at Scarecrow Video, which is kind of like a famous video store here in Seattle and has one of the largest, at that time, I think it was one of the largest film libraries in the world, or like video libraries, I guess I should say. And since then, so many other video archive, like actually, I think the actual video archives, and I think Kim's in New York and Vidiot's in LA. I mean, there are a couple other video stores, but so many of them started closing down. Oh, Movie Madness in Portland, and some of them are still around, but I think Scarecrow might technically be the largest now. I'm not positive about that. But yeah, there I met other people who are into film, and I met this guy, JD Dasgupta, who's also aspiring. Basically, like we, for a while, I was like, oh, I moved to New York to make movies, and Deep basically was like me and his partner at the time, Tabby. They were going to move to LA, and they basically convinced me to move with them. We all got a place together, and so we lived in Silver Lake for a while. Made a couple short films there, and then I decided I was going to move back to Seattle, thinking that that would be an easier place to make movies than LA, which was, of course, not at all the case. And I had a different movie that I was planning to make called My Friend the Wire, which is sort of like almost like a Cronenberg meets, high school coming of age type of thing. And I was trying to find a producer for that, and everyone was basically telling me like, yeah, this you're not going to be able to do it on this budget. So finally I realized like, okay, whatever I do, I'm probably going to have to produce it myself. And so I decided I had another script called The Mountain, the River, and the Road, which at the time seemed like it would be a lot more of a straightforward kind of road trip romance. But again, like in the like, because I guess I like to do everything like the hard way. We basically, so we had family who actually lived in Lake, so about 3 hours out of LA. And I was like, well, that'll be a great location for for the majority of the scenes. I had just moved back to Washington and basically had this idea that like it's gonna be kind of like cinema verite. We're going to like shoot it while we're on the road and like get that energy. Yeah, and somehow like I talked a bunch of people into working on that film with me. And and nobody got paid. Like I think at best we maybe covered people's expenses. And even with that, you know, it's pretty incredible. I think some of it has to do with like there's that perfect age when you're in, I think maybe your 20s, you know, where maybe you've worked a little bit enough to have like, you know, some moving around money, you know, so you can kind of decide like, oh, I'm gonna go travel here or I'm gonna do that. So yeah, it's still like especially the further I get from it, the more I'm amazed that like how that all came together. Plus, we shot it on film, which, you know, at the time, you know, is right when was it like the HVX 100? HVX 100, is that right? I feel like the number is wrong, but like the HVX was like the digital camera that was starting to get picked up by a lot of people and looking a lot more cinematic. So like I think let's see. So at that point, like Lynn Shelton, who is a Seattle filmmaker, who I befriended, and actually like she gave me a lot of tips when I was thinking of coming back to Seattle to shoot. Sorry, I might be getting totally off track here.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, finish your thought, please. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, no,
So
you're good.
yeah.
Mhm.
So Lynn had shot her first film on film and had already done her I'm blanking on it. But her second feature she shot on the HVX. And of course this was the time where like mumblecore was kind of becoming a thing. Yeah, so some of the filmmakers were shooting on the HVX and getting some cinematic stuff, but still I just kind of felt like for the longevity, I was like, oh, film, we have to shoot it on film. I would absolutely never have like looking back, I wouldn't recommend that, you know, to anyone. It's just like again that idea of trying to do everything sort of like, I mean, I suppose I looked at it as like this is the right way of doing things, but
Mm.
in hindsight, it's like, no, I'm just making everything more difficult than it needs to be. Yeah, and that was God, that was like a rough shoot. So it was about, I think it was, we were technically on the road, I think 3 weeks, but some of
Mm.
those were travel days. So and then of course you have weekends. And so I think I don't remember what our actual shooting days were, but I think we may have shot like maybe it was 12 or 13 days. It was something, I think that might have been like the actual number of days we shot. Yeah, but it was that was tough. I was looking at movies like Two Lane Blacktop and Cockfighter from Monty Hellman, you know, and oh, what was it? Don Coscarelli had done a movie called Kenny and Co. And just these movies that I don't know how they were necessarily made, but they felt very like, you know, like seat of the pants, low budget filmmaking. And I found that really charming. And that was part of the energy I was kind of hoping to capture with it. And basically, after wrapping, the actors, let's see, because I worked with Justin Rice, Tipper Newton, and Joe Swanberg were the leads, and they Joe especially had a very improvisational approach. Tipper, I think, had worked both ways. She had already done scripted and like improvisational stuff. And Justin, I'm trying to remember actually. I think Justin also had that experience, but I do remember like I'd written the script and I remember when we were talking with Joe, he was like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to memorize the script." And like of course alarm bells were going off in my mind at that time. But I was like, okay, yeah, we can work with that. And so it ended up being that we would use the script as sort of like almost like an outline. So, and this is what we used in basically all the films we made since, which was like the script is there as something to sort of like support you. And whenever you needed something, it was always there. You could always use it. But then, like, feel free to go off from there. Use that as a jumping off point. And that ended up working out pretty well. It was a one camera shoot. So with shooting on video, we could have shot like both actors at the same time. But what we ended up doing is kind of getting traditional coverage, but with non-traditional approaches. So like I would have a wide shot and then I'd have close-ups of the actors, but things wouldn't necessarily like line up. So a lot of the trick in the editing was trying to both like shape the dialogue and not make it feel all herky-jerky unless it suited the story. So I think like if you think of like how Goddard would shoot, dialogue like that, he would just totally cut for content, even on a single shot, so you get all the jump cuts. And I tried to kind of it didn't seem like that was really the right approach to cutting this. So that of course drug out the whole like editing process even further. Yeah, it was it was a feat.
That's all really amazing though, because like all these kind of non-conventional ways, like kind of clearly added to the aesthetic of it then, like just filming it on film. And that's really fascinating. And basically using the script as a template rather than something set in stone. I find that all really interesting. But so you mentioned that you went to school originally thinking you were going to be a business major. So then what made you shift and decide to focus on graphic design and things like that?
Oh yeah. So basically, so after Mountain, the River, the Road, what was it? It's like it did like okay in the festivals, but it didn't score big on any of the big ones. Like we didn't get into Sundance, we didn't get into South by. We got a distribution deal that got us into Sundance Channel International, and we played at WNET 13 in New York. But I think that was sort of that and along with the film festivals, that was kind of like the limit of it. So we took the money from the distribution deal, made Lauren is Missing, which is even scrappier, trying to use some of those lessons. And
Mm.
after that, made another short film called Pets, and basically just felt like I hit a wall as far as filmmaking went. Like I was kind of out of money and unable to do sort of like the indie filmmaker route. Let's see. I was taking on like side gigs, shooting like doing events and stuff like that. And I kind of was at a point where I was going to have to make a really big investment in event specific equipment just to make that work out. And as I'm like pricing everything down, I'm like looking at, okay, I'll get this camera used, maybe oh my God. Yeah, this was also at the time that Final Cut went to Final Cut X, and it seemed like the industry wasn't going with, or even in the indie industry wasn't going with it. We're moving to Adobe, which at that point was pre subscription based. So it was like it was basically going to cost somewhere between like 10 and $20,000 to sort of get current with the equipment.
Wow.
And I was like, and just to shoot like events. And I do feel like, you know, you find your own way to like enjoy a certain thing. And like I'd found ways to sort of like enjoy event production and post-production. But when I was faced at that kind of a financial equipment and or commitment and trying to I was just like, well, I don't think I love it that much, you know? And so then it was kind of like a lot of soul searching. My friend Don Black, who I met through the film festivals and who starred in Pets, he's also a fantastic filmmaker and musician in his own right. He was like, man, you should really look into advertising. He's like, I've got a lot of friends who are doing advertising. That's how they are paying the bills. So after talking to him, I met a local guy named James Gilmer through a mutual friend of ours, actually Andrew Toms, who co-wrote the music for Mountain, the River, and the Road. And I was talking to James about he's gonna kill me. But so James is actually does a cool podcast called Euphemet. I'll just throw that out there, which is all about kind of supernatural stuff, like like Bigfoot, goat, like the whole gamut of things. So at that time, James was in design and advertising, and so I just like had to sit down with him, and I was just like, does this even make sense? Like, is like, could I make that kind of a jump? And James was really encouraging and told me to look into classes at a place called School of Visual Concepts. And that's actually how he and Andrew had met. And and after spending so much time with the computer, again, I was like, I don't think I want to do that. Like, I think I want to do, or I don't want to I wanted to find something that would allow me to get away from the computer. And at that time, I was like, I'll do copywriting. I've been writing, all the screenplays and stuff. And I was like, with copywriting, I can go, I'll work out of a cafe and I'll be able to observe people and just like I had this very romantic
Mm.
notion of it. And so, yeah, I started taking classes at School of Visual Concepts, was taking copywriting classes from Mike Peterson. And yeah, sorry, I may have gotten derailed from the question, but yeah, that basically yeah, started with copywriting. And a lot of my concepts were very like image plus copy based, where it was like, my idea was sort of like in the back of my mind, and it's still actually in the back of my mind with like graphic design and any kind of communication, this idea of like, okay, how can you communicate something in a glance? And so I was like, okay, very simple imagery and a strong headline. And if one of them is like maybe a little bit off, even better, like something that could knock people out of their comfort zone a little bit. Not necessarily violently, but in a maybe a confusing way. And so anyway, there, yeah, through School of Visual Concepts, one of our projects was to do a campaign for Black Black gum, which is like a black caffeinated stick gum from Japan. And so my concept was like Black Black completes you, and it was going to be all like photo based. And so it was pretty dark. It was like the idea of having I had like a picture of a three-legged dog,
Mm.
and one of its legs was replaced by Black Black gum.
Wow.
Uh, there was like a family where
Mm.
like behind them they had like the family portrait, and it was like like a nuclear family,
Mm.
a husband, wife, and a child. And then like there's like a black sash around the photo, and in the foreground it was the husband, wife, and instead of the child it was a stick of black black gum. And
Mm.
so it was like Black Black you know completes you was the
Mhm.
and so when we're trying to make our portfolios, I kind of decided that was going to be really difficult to do as a shoot. And And another copywriter, Butch Smith, he had done one that basically like this isn't what it would say in the campaign, but like it was a very long copy concept, and it was basically like black is cocaine is sort of the subtext of everything, and it was just all these crazy characters who were like amped up out of their mind.
Mhm.
And so I saw that that could work really well as like an illustrated campaign. And so I approached Butch and I was like, "Hey, would you be down to like collaborate? You know, I'll use your copy and I'll do all the illustrations and we'll both have a portfolio piece." And so he said, "Sure." So I went ahead and did those illustrations. And when we finally completed that, I submitted them to the American Advertising Awards or the Addies. And basically, like it ended up, yeah. And I guess the same year I ended up volunteering. And that's actually how I met Howie. Because what was it? The campaign did well and we won a local, I think gold in the local local student category. And at one of the dinners there, I was able to meet Howie. And I don't think I was familiar with his work at that moment. It was, he was just kind of like introduced to me like, oh, this is Howie, he's one of the judges and Hallie like was like, "Oh, I liked your work," and I was like, "Oh, thanks," and I totally just thought he was being like polite at the time,
Mm.
like he's stuck talking to someone whose work he saw, and he's just trying to say nice things, so it wasn't like, "Oh yeah, we remember that campaign. That was awful." And then later on, it was after that, I think, that I found out that we had actually gotten a gold. And I don't remember at what point, but at some point from there, Howie reached out and with the idea of doing Magoo. And so at that point, I was still pretty much like up in the air. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. I had been taking, what was it, branding classes, art direction classes. Was Black Bike? I guess Black Bike was the second copywriting class. So I think I was done with the copywriting classes at that point. And the instructor had kind of pushed me towards really art direction and and just with like the climate of creative in Seattle, that's sort of how I ended up more in like graphic design. Like there were and I think there still are a few like advertising agencies here, but at the time we had a ton of boutique agencies, and that I could totally have seen myself working into. But just as like advertising started going more and more in-house, a lot of that started like disappearing. And a lot of my freelance work was sort of a combination of just straight up, like some of them, there'd be some art direction to it. Yeah, so sometimes they'd have like copy, or sometimes, yeah, like copy but no concept, if that makes sense. And so it'd be like, okay, like how do we make this like visually interesting and visually arresting? And then other times it was pretty much like straight up design work. And so I think it really became when I got my first in-house job at well, they were called GCH, but the brand was for Willie's Reserve, which was Willie Nelson's cannabis company. It was a small startup, and basically I became sort of like a jack of all trades there, where it was like art direction and sometimes copywriting for their ads, design for like, collateral, and even a little bit of illustration for like icons and stuff like that.
Well, that's all really cool because like what you were saying before that you want someone to like be captivated by the image and the slogan, right? Whatever it may be. That's really, I find that really interesting. And so obviously, yeah, of course, I interviewed Howie Ronay, the author of Magoo and His Magic Poo. So tell me about how you connected with Magoo and His Magic Poo and then creating the illustrations, creating the character.
Absolutely. So with that, yeah, what was it? How did that work? So Howie
Mm.
reached out. He told me about it. I thought the poop was funny, and I liked the message, of it, and just this idea of, I also in the copywriting class, I had done like this campaign that was supposed to be for the Humane Society that was all talking about how like, oh, you don't want any of those like sickly purebred mutts. You want like a sturdy little love mutt. And so like the idea of kind of taking on like puppy mills in a children's story, I was really intrigued by that. I definitely was a little bit nervous because I was like, is this too much for kids? Like, is this just going to like bum them out? But also that was kind of what I enjoyed about it. Like I think, a lot of times I think adults, myself included, have this way of, sort of underestimating what kids are ready for or what they're able to like take in. And I definitely enjoy the like juxtaposition of, you know, horribleness and cutesiness. Like that's one of the things that I just like I love it in film. I love it in design. I love it in like, characters and monsters and stuff like that. And so I wish I could remember if there was like a single lightning bolt thing, but I think it was like I saw a real opportunity. Like I saw a direct line between the black work and that kind of illustration that I was really enjoying at the time and some of the villainous characters in Magoo, and the idea that it wouldn't have to be just like a very cutesy story. Like the cat might be cute, but like the world could be kind of like grotesque and visceral, and that really appealed to me and my aesthetic, and I think that's what like Howie saw in the work I'd done for Black. And so the fact that he didn't want me to do, you know, like, oh yeah, I like that work, but now I want you to just do something really cute. He was totally open to like, yeah, we can really like push this. I think that was what really got me excited about working on it.
I love that because, you're so right. You got Magoo, who's this adorable little kitty, and of course, all the puppies. But then you have like those kind of, in a way, like these grotesque monster type characters with the villains, mean and angry looking. And then you have that cool image of Magoo when he first sees the puppy mill and looks like kind of like this haunted house, basically. So I love how you capture these emotions in those images. I think that's really amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear about your project, Wayward Ghouls, in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So, probably even like monsters have always sort of been a thing I've been obsessed with. And so is like toy collecting. And, like I've collected, I held on to a lot of my toys when I was a kid, and of course like your ability to collect totally ebbs and flows depending on like where you are with like streams of income. So that's like been an in and out type of thing in my life. But like back at, yeah, back when I was at or I guess when they became long play, I was already for Willie's Reserve, guess I should say that probably makes more sense. I was already thinking of ways to sort of like engage with the toy community and toy creators. And honestly, I thought that would end up being more from like a graphic design perspective. Like maybe I could collaborate with someone and make a book that like collects toy art or something like that. And I think what ended up happening is so my partner Kirsten and I love Halloween. And so one of the things we'll do every year is sort of like up our little like Halloween display. And I kind of got into making creatures for that. And so we called our house like the Belvedere home for Wayward Ghouls. And the idea there was that it was kind of like, okay, well, as opposed to just being like, some threatening place that you're going to, that's horror orient. It's like it has horror, but the idea is it's like this was for all of like the misfits out there, the people who don't fit in. Like those are the wayward ghouls. And I wish I could remember how like I don't know what that leap was. But at some point, it occurred to me that like, well, I knew I could kind of start creating characters for the haunted house, or haunted house. More, it's really just a yard display. Like it really is. I don't want to like make it sound bigger than it is, but I had started creating a couple characters for that. Was crafting like stuff out of foam, and at some point, I guess I decided that I could make these into toys, and so when I left Willie's, I worked at Funko, and there I basically was able to, the way that Funko was structured, you didn't really have a great way to see behind the scenes. But what I was able to, or like of the business structure, if that makes sense. But I was able to like, I met sculptors and I met concept artists, and that totally demystified like at least the creative aspect of making a toy. And my old boss at Willie's Reserve, Diane Ross, she came from publishing and from children's toys. So Diane had over the years we worked together, had total, I was able to just ask her how things work from like a manufacturing standpoint. And so at the point that was let go of Funko, I was kind of at a place where I was just like, I finally had like the two parts of the puzzle, through Funko, so basically like I was part of the second round of layoffs. Like they ran into some business trouble, and through those two rounds of layoffs, there was kind of like an online community of like sculptors and concept artists, who are starting to build like their portfolios and whatnot. And after the layoff, I had kind of explored the idea of maybe doing t-shirts or something. And again, that wasn't something that I was all that excited about. And somehow again, it just occurred to me like, you know what, maybe I can, you know, turn some of these characters into like I was already trying to make monsters for the t-shirts and the haunted house or the yard display, and I couldn't figure out how to make either of those into any kind of a business. And I think something must have clicked with the idea of like, what if I like toys, like making any kind of toy like tends to have like a really high startup cost, which is one of the reasons I'd sort of like shied away from it. But I think probably through the desperation of the moment, you're kind of like, well, if I do something like a Kickstarter, like maybe that's a way that I can finance this. And so that's basically sort of where I'm at with Wayward Ghouls. I reached out to a sculptor who I was like a big fan of. His name's Creature, or his name's Adam Doherty, but he goes by Creature Kid, and he's done. I hope I don't screw up all of his credits, but like he's worked for like Guillermo del Toro. He's done stuff for like Disney, Marvel, and what was it? And I think I discovered him because he made this thing called the Puglu, which is this kind of like pug monster that really captured, like both kind of cute and gross all in one. And that was sort of like the kind of thing I wanted to bring to like the Wayward Ghouls. And so I reached out to him in hopes that he would be interested in collaborating. And I honestly didn't think anything would I didn't think he was gonna like give me the time of day. But I kind of made the pitch to him, and he was like, you know what, I totally want to make a toy like that. And basically that got the ball rolling. And so our first creature is its name is Squeaks. You can kind of see a little teaser on the website, but at this point, I'm still working on the prototype. I brought in my mom to help me. So the creature is kind of different materials. So I have Adam's parts printed out, and we need to kind of fabricate the rest and make the first prototype. But I'm really hoping that in the next couple, it might just be a couple weeks, but hopefully at least in the next couple months, I'll have that first prototype and be able to do a little bit more like teaser images and be in a stage to start like collecting email addresses in preparation for that Kickstarter. But yeah, fingers crossed. I'm excited for that.
That's awesome. That's very exciting. So they're going to be figurines or like what exactly?
Yeah, I actually haven't quite settled on the size, but it's kind of like a hybrid plush figure. Are you familiar with My Pet Monster?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. So they're characters where like it's a mix where they're fuzzy monsters, and so like part of them are plush, but then also some of their features are vinyl.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Okay. I could like envision it. Yeah.
And so the hope is that by combining the two, it's like it makes them feel even more like tangible and real. So it has like, fur plush parts. And so you can actually like hold them and like and squeeze them and hug them. But they also have these kind of very real monstrous features.
That's fascinating. I like that. And so obviously this is like a big part, like you love monsters and stuff. Did you love that stuff growing up too? I know you mentioned before you're a big fan of comics and video games. I'd love to hear about like some of those influences for you too.
Oh yeah. The influences are God all over the place. I think it all starts with like movies like Gremlins, Chris
Mhm.
Walas's work, and then of course like Rick Baker's work in like Gremlins 2. These ideas of like seeing, and I guess that's probably what attracted me to makeup effects at the time
Mhm.
too, is like, so with like Gremlins, Ghostbusters, I wanted those creatures to like exist in the real world where you could kind of like touch them and interact with them. And so that's probably some of the earliest influences. And I vaguely remember like Ghostbusters got me, I was in a comic shop and there was this comic company called Now Comics. And so they were publishing both the real Ghostbusters comic and also this comic called Ralph Snart Adventures. And I believe the creator's Mark Hansen. And his art was very like Ed Roth inspired, and Ed Roth did like Rat Fink. And so I think I think that might have been my first exposure to the illustrated version of these kind of creatures. I wasn't able to find that comic elsewhere, but it kind of made me excited for that type of subject that may have led to what was it? My buddy and I loved this cartoon called Eek the Cat. And of course like Ren and Stimpy and before that who was it? Bakshi's take on like Mighty Mouse had a very like Ren and Stimpy kind of gross out thing to it. Let's see. Other comic artists, I'd say right now Charles Burns is probably the person that I like hold in just like he's like perfection. Like what he does is like perfection. And if I could just, you know, steal someone's ability to express himself in an art form, it would probably be like him. So like Charles Burns, Dan Klaus, Basil Wolverton, like some of the Mad Magazine, like some of the classics, which was maybe a little bit ahead of my time, but oh yeah, but I like discovered some of them through this book called The Blighted Eye, which is by Glenn Bray. And so he was an early collector of a lot of like underground comics and kind of like brought attention to people like Basil Wolverton, Robert Crumb, and a lot of the kind of like early psychedelic artists and a lot of the underground artists. God, what else? And of course, some of them were like pretty obvious people at the time. Like, I was reading the weekly comic strips. So I loved like Calvin and Hobbes. I remember loving like Bill Watterson's Monsters. And what was it? I'd been turned on to Todd McFarlane and his like Spider-Man and Spawn comics. and he had a way of sort of like illustrating stuff that I had just never seen before. And I may have kind of like moved on to like underground artists since then, but I feel like the way that he would build up a page, and tell a story and just like and really just revel also in like like violence and monsters,
Mhm.
like at an early age, that's the kind of stuff that like I think, you know, as a little boy, like I think that little boy angst kind of like gravitates towards. Although as years go by, the violence I find more off-putting, but the monsters I still love, you
Mm.
know, and I think it's like as a kid, I remember like I really loved the Disney Beauty and the Beast movie because in that one, like what you think of as the villain, the monster is, maybe has some questionable practices of things. Like it's okay to imprison
Right.
imprison women for some reason. But, I guess at that age I wasn't thinking too much about that side of things, but definitely saw like, oh well, he's just misunderstood.
Right.
So yeah, that's probably like a random Adrian Tomine was also like a big influence, probably more almost more from like a storytelling standpoint. But yeah, sorry, that's just a rambling bunch
No, I
of
love it. I love hearing about all that. It is fascinating just thinking about monsters in media, so to speak, because a lot of it, like for kids, for example, like kids are afraid of monsters. And then obviously, like say Monsters Inc., for example, which is you have like the visually interesting appeal of monsters, like, oh, okay, they're furry, they got fangs, whatever, however, like you may picture them in your head. But then like there's this humanity to it. I do find it honestly really interesting and like hearing all these different forms of monster characters and all that stuff. That's really cool. I think it's
oh,
really cool.
absolutely. Well, I think that's what maybe even brings like, there's definitely like an overlap with, horror
Mm.
movies, stuff like that. But I think there is this sort of like there's something going on with like monsters, punk rock, outsider or misfit culture. And I think like, the idea of like not fitting in, I think like for sure, like even as an adult, I don't feel like I necessarily fit in, but I don't think that has to be even be like a lifelong thing for you to identify with monsters. I think kids for sure feel like they're in a world that they don't belong, and I think that's an easy way to be like. I think that's one of the reasons we might be drawn to monsters from a young age.
I agree with that. That's so true. That's relatable, certainly for kids, certainly for everyone who's ever felt like an outsider or felt like they didn't belong. And then again, how we can connect that with our own humanity. I'd love to hear also specifically about your project, Last Prisoner Project. I'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah, so that happened when I was at Willie's Reserve. So Willie's Reserve had the benefit of like having Willie Nelson's name. And as a startup, we didn't necessarily have, you know, the funds to do a whole lot, but we were able to basically like donate time. So Last Prisoner Project, as cannabis became legalized throughout, in different states of the nation, what ended up happening was that you had people, in some cases, sentenced to a life in prison for nonviolent cannabis-related crimes. And what they had done had become legal. And so there were people making, in some cases, millions and millions of dollars off of what had sent them to prison. So the idea of the Last Prisoner Project was that they were trying to legally change those laws to update and free the people who were basically locked up for something that was now considered legal. Yeah, I think some of the worst cases were in like Oklahoma. And so these were all nonviolent offenders also. I think Oklahoma, if you were, what was it? I'm sure I'm going to mess this up, but if you were sort of caught with enough cannabis to be considered, dealing or trafficking, I guess, whatever the right term is, It was sort of like an automatic like life sentence. That was sort of the idea of, the kind of tough on crime policy. So yeah, what was amazing about that? So let's see, the VP of brand, Elizabeth Hogan, she had kind of said that Willie's wanted to partner with Last Prisoner Project. And the way we were going to do it was to sort of like show up with them at some of like Willie's Outlaw tour. And so I think they had their own sort of brand that they were kind of doing online, but it was very clean. And the idea was like, well, let's make something that we could bring to our show and really like get people interested in it. And I think it basically had started with the idea of, I think it really did just start with like, let's make a sticker. I think that was the real point. Basically, the thing was though that I had a lot of freedom with it. So I got a chance to talk with the Last Prisoner Project folks. We knew we were going to do a sticker. And so I basically like took that sticker idea and I was like, I'm going to try to turn this into sort of more of a logo, or at least a logo-like project that I could apply to the places where we're going to appear together. And so the founder was known for like, always flashing the peace sign in photos. And so Elizabeth said, like, you should look at that and start there. And so I kind of came up with this logo illustration that I wanted it to be just like a little bit of rough, not too like polished, and very stark. So I did play around with some colorways that I may have even got printed on the first round of stickers, but basically like it was the black and white version that really stuck out. And they loved it and they wanted to keep working with us on that. And so that was like music to my ears. So from there, I made sort of like a book that would kind of like accompany them at the shows. And so I was able to talk with the Last Prisoner Project, hear some of the stories of the different people, what their circumstances were. So I was able to find, like, it was really important to me that like as people, especially in light of legalization, as people kind of like go through and encounter this project, they're able to see that these are people just like me, like under different circumstances. This could be me. These are parents. These are kids. And so like being able to sort of like immediately kind of like grab people's attention. So like as people are going through like the pages of this, I wanted them to see like parents and family and people who uh you know they might relate to, because I think a lot of that can seem really abstract. And for me, certainly like a lot of that was abstract going into things. But the irony isn't lost that like, well, okay, here I am like branding and designing for something that was, illegal before. And maybe it's not illegal while I'm working on it, but I'm getting like a steady paycheck for something that other people, like all the groundwork was laid by people who broke the law, in different ways. And you can look, it's like, well, yeah, it was illegal at the time, but like all of that culture that they created is what the business, and all the money, you know, that's a debt that I feel like all of us who work at the industry at any point, like that's a debt we sort of owe to the people who came before. It's like some people, and probably the businesses that don't do as well, they looked at cannabis and they're like, this is a brand new industry. We're starting from scratch. And that's not true at all. Like all the strains, all of like the artistry, that goes into growing this product, like that's decades of work that was happening, you know, basically in the black market. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm definitely rambling about that.
That's all very powerful though, hearing all that, because again, like what you were saying, this all goes back to connecting and like that immediate reaction, whatever it may be, to whatever they're engaging with in terms of like a logo, for example, and things like that. But this just actually occurred to me, hearing you say all this, like because we're talking about humanity, things like that. What do you, I mean, this is a whole, perhaps a whole other, this is a whole other topic, but like the rise of AI nowadays and like AI art and all that garbage, honestly. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, please.
Man, okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, it like as a creative, I find it terrifying. And honestly, that's, what was it? After being laid off at Funko, and seeing AI, because I feel like we're probably just maybe even a couple months away from AI possibly taking over graphic design. And as you see just creatives getting laid off left and right, you're
Yeah.
like, well, we may not be there now, but I think we're going to be there extremely soon. And that was one of the reasons why the idea of like trying to create a new company, sort of appealed to me. Like when I was first laid off, the idea was like, well, that's a terrible idea, just like I've thrown my money in movies, I'd seen how like that could go south. The idea of starting a company, that's probably not a great idea, especially because you'd be competing with giant companies with big IP. But yeah, I mean, the philosophical part of AI is like kind of like we were talking about film and video back with, in the filmmaking days. Like AI really reminds me of that moment in time where there was this like ride or die, film or nothing movement really early on when I started like taking classes. And I definitely felt a part of that. I was like, well, especially before video was at a point where yeah, I thought it was beautiful. You're kind of like, oh, this can never replace film. But o over the years, you're like, oh, actually, yeah, here we go. It's absolutely taking over film. It's at some point in between, I remember giving someone advice, like they weren't asking for this advice, I should say, but they were about to start shooting their own short, and they threw out that they were going to be shooting it on film. And at this point, this was after I'd already done Mountain, the River, and the Road, because I think that's why they had reached out to me. And I was like, you know what? Shoot it on video because it's so much less expensive. You're going to have a chance to like learn much faster than if you're shooting on film. You can just be more prolific. Yeah, I guess that doesn't really apply to AI. But what did is like you just saw lots of people, like the person who did our film processing, Ryan Adams. He's also a cinematographer, but he did our processing. He did our color timing, and he was kind of coming up through the sort of like old school film lab world, I guess, and working his way up through that at a place called Alpha Cine. And basically, like a few years after we worked together on Mountain, the River, and the Road, they basically like closed up as a film lab. And so you just completely saw tons of film folks getting put out of work at jobs that were considered like real stable. And I came to design later in my career, but you know, I think similar things happen where you transition from, paste up work to like a completely digital workflow. I think film by far was probably most reluctant to kind of like go into the digital age. But I know like design people had those kind of pains and like typography, like being a typographer used to be like an actual career that you could have where like you'd work with a designer and the designer would like lay out how the type should work, but someone else would actually, like set that type for them in one of the what is it? The photo, I'm blanking on the name, but like it was like a photography process where they would lay out the letters and set the typography for that. And so like, yeah, I have no idea what AI is going to look like in the future for us. I think it's going to be like, I do think it'll be devastating. I I hope it's not, I hope it doesn't mean the end for like people created art. Like I do like to think that there will always be a place for that in the same way that like you would have thought that engraving is a style of art that was lost to time.
Mm,
And yet, and then probably like what 10, 15 years ago, you have a whole bunch of people, like designers and illustrators who love the look of old engraving. And maybe they didn't necessarily like learn how to reproduce it in exactly the old style way, but they did bring that kind of aesthetic back. And then of course when you look at people doing like woodcut art, they actually are bringing back the old techniques,
mm.
of like hand cutting wood or linoleum and like rolling the ink on and doing it that way. And same thing with like silk screening, even in the age of like digital prints, you have people in garage shops, either like Jim Madison from like Print Mafia. He's still photocopying and silk screening his posters himself. And I know like plenty of people are have like their t-shirt studios where they're like silk screening in garages. So I hope that like many things, it ends up being more of an evolution of the way things are done, and that there is always a place for that people created art. I do hope it doesn't necessarily mean that that's only a hobby or a novelty, or a special thing. Like I hope people can still have careers, and like commercial careers, doing that type of stuff. Yeah. I mean, personally, I'd love to see AI take over for the CEOs and let the creatives do more of the interesting work and throw the power of AI into figuring out how do we make people created work commercially viable, as opposed to trying to think of how can we eliminate people from work.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Yes, well said, Michael. It's been such an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. So as we're wrapping up, I love asking about, to like end this interview, I like asking for advice. This could be advice for artists, best advice you've gotten, general life advice, any advice you'd love to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think some of it is there's going to be a lot, like if for someone going through a creative field, or really I think any kind of field, the truth is I think no matter what you do in life, there's going to be a lot of like banging your head against the wall before like, you get things right. And, like understand that you're going to hear no a lot. And no matter what I can say, that's going to be like discouraging. But keep going. And the one thing to remember, I would say, is don't say no for someone else. Let them reject you, and let them say no, you're not the right fit, but don't reject yourself before you've even applied or tried for something. Like that's probably like that's probably, I guess, the biggest advice I could give someone is, really anything, but particularly creative. And it's a type of thing that like, you know it's a guideline that I also try to live by. Like I would hand it to someone else because it's also the type of thing that I constantly having to like remind myself, like,
Hmm.
okay, no, no, you're rejecting yourself. Don't do that. Let them do that.
I never heard a phrase like that before. Don't say no for someone else. That's really good advice. I love that. Very well put. So this was great, Michael. Thanks so much. So please feel free to share your social media, any other projects you'd like to promote.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, this was a blast. Thank you, Ali.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you can find out more about Wayward Ghouls, or soon you can find
Mm.
out more at waywardghouls.com. Right now, all it is a little landing page, but you can enter your email address and follow along when we have our first updates, hopefully very soon. As far as graphic design, I'm at michaelherring.com. And I'm on Instagram at Mike Harring. Oh, and I should say that's Harring, because that's easy and innocently confused with HE.
True, that's too funny. Even honestly, my name, people always like default to Allison with two L's. I'm like, nope, it's one L. I don't know, just
Oh
like
yeah.
small. Yeah, it's too funny. But I can't thank you enough for your time. This is great.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a blast. I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to talk. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, absolutely. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to check out storytellingsaga.com, and as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Until next time, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.